One Sunday morning in the middle of August 2013, my family and I finished packing up the minivan and set off on the 800-plus kilometer trip from our home in Cleveland, Ohio, to our annual vacation spot at the southern tip of New Jersey for 2 weeks of beach and boardwalk relaxation. The day after we arrived, our middle child, Rebecca, who had recently turned 5, became ill, and we took her to a local urgent care center where she was diagnosed with strep throat. So they gave us antibiotics and sent us on our way. And we gave her the antibiotics over the next couple of days, but her symptoms actually gradually got worse instead of better. Until that Thursday evening, just before dinner time, she was waiting with my wife in the emergency room of a local medical center when she had a sudden grand mal seizure. She came out of it within a minute and was rushed for a CT scan, and actually seemed better than she had in days. But within less than half an hour, she had a second, far more severe seizure, her heart rate and respiration plummeting to the point that the code blue alarms went off. Within seconds, the ER staff broke into a crash cart, intubated her, and stabilized her by using paralytic drugs to induce a coma. So in less than 3 days, our little girl had gone from playing on the beach to the literal brink of death, and we had no idea how it had happened. The CT scan showed that there was a large mass in the center of her brain, and at that point, the medical center staff informed us that she would be life-flighted to the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, about 150 kilometers away. When the helicopter arrived, it had the pilot and the co-pilot and 4 emergency medical technicians on board. They were there because her condition was so severe that even with them present, no one could assure us she would even survive the flight to Philadelphia. There was no room for me or my wife aboard, even if we'd been allowed. And so the helicopter took off for Philadelphia with our medically comatose daughter aboard, leaving us behind, not knowing if we would ever see her alive again. Someone we barely knew volunteered to drive us to Philadelphia, and so we found ourselves sitting in the backseat of a stranger's car, barreling up the Garden State Parkway at 11 o'clock at night, barely able to comprehend what was happening. And in moments like that, there are a surprisingly small number of thoughts that go through your head. And the thought that kept returning to us over and over was, how do we get to our daughter? Not, is she all right? Or even, will she be all right? But how do we get to her as quickly as possible? And it took a little bit of time, probably longer than you might believe, but eventually I realized that I could try to find out the answer to this question. I thought, I have a pocket internet terminal. I could use it to find out what to do. So I pulled out my iPhone, and I Googled Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, tapped the top result, and this is what I saw. I needed to know how to get to my critically, possibly fatally ill child, and this is what I saw. Although that's not quite accurate. To be more precise, this is what I saw. I saw a brochure, out of focus, not because of tears in my eyes, I was too far in shock for that, but because I lacked the mental capacity to understand what I was seeing. Steve Krug famously said, "Don't make me think." This is a situation where I almost literally could not think. But I still had instinct, and so after a few moments, 20 years of web experience started to assert themselves. And I started pinching and zooming around, trying to figure out where the information was to tell us what to do and how to find her. So I zoomed into the center column, because that's where the content goes. But there was nothing there for me. My child has. I didn't know. I had no way of answering that question. Find a specialty or service by first letter. There was nothing there for me. So I panned to the left, where I found press releases, which, if anything, was even more useless. Also, the welcome kit section, which at first I remember thinking, oh, okay, well, we're going to the hospital, a welcome kit would be useful. This actually turned out to be where you could get a video guide for parents and families, and also how to send an e-card. So I panned upward, and that's when I saw it, the navigation, which I had missed initially, the very tastefully designed and integrated navigation that I had skipped in my distraction. For patients and visitors, seemed like it might apply, so I tapped that, and I got a drop down on my smartphone. Now, I want to reiterate that all of the text basically looked like this, blurry and out of focus, and I remember squinting at it as though that would somehow make it come into focus or maybe grant me some sort of mental power-up. Unfortunately, neither occurred. But I looked at this, and eventually I decided that type of visit probably applied because this was, after all, a type of visit. So I tapped that, and I got this. I know you can't read that. There are 4 options here: outpatient visit, inpatient visit, surgical visit, and emergency room visit. Even now, looking back at this with relative dispassion and all of the insider knowledge I've built up in the meantime, I still cannot tell you which of these is actually relevant to the situation that we were in. I would argue that none of them are. Now, my wife, Kat, is an advanced practice nurse. She actually has several advanced practice degrees, including a doctorate in nursing. So over the years, in helping her study for her boards, and also just hearing her talk with her nursing friends, I've absorbed some of the lingo. I happen to know that outpatient visit did not apply to us at that moment. Outpatient visit is, when you go in and you have an appointment and then you go home. That's what we hoped would happen, but that was not our situation. Maybe inpatient, but we weren't inpatient yet. Surgical visit, I assumed there might be surgery in the future, at least I hoped so at that point, because the alternatives were worse. But no one had said that she was going to the surgical unit, because at that moment she wasn't. Emergency room visit might have seemed like it applied, except the lay flight helicopter does not land at the emergency room. And so, skipping outpatient, because again, with that insider knowledge, I knew not to do that. I tried them in order. Here's inpatient. And surgical was no better than this. These massive walls of text that are all about what to do for your planned visit, your planned inpatient visit. What documents to bring and what to pack. And remember, we had already left, and I was not going to turn around if they said, please make sure to bring your driver's license. We were not turning around at that moment. Eventually, I caught on to the fact that there's a For Patients and Visitors hub page. This is it, or at least was. The Children's Hospital of Philadelphia has redesigned since I took these screen captures. But pretty much everything I'm telling you still applies. It looks different, but there's really been no change. You got to this, the way to get this was to tap on For Patients and Visitors, and then ignore the drop-down and tap on For Patients and Visitors again, and then you get this page. Sometime later, I went through every single one of these links. There was nothing here to help us with what we needed to know right then. How do we get to our daughter in the shortest possible time? There isn't even anything here for what do we do when we get to the hospital. Now, some of you may have spotted what looks like a solution to our problem. There is a phone number on every page of this design. I don't think I ever saw it. You might have noticed it's in the sidebar. Jen Simmons has observed, and not the only one, but Jen Simmons has recently observed, the sidebar is where we put things that we don't want anyone to see. But the thing is, even if I had seen it, I'm not sure that it would have helped, because I was holding an iPhone in my hand, and it never once occurred to me that it was a phone, which is the standard joke, right? That night, sitting in the back of that car, we literally forgot that. There were a total of 4 people in that car. Every single one of us had a smartphone, and not one of us thought to say, hey, you know what, let's try calling the hospital and see what they tell us to do. And if you want to know the weirdly, surreally, almost hilarious part, I was using my phone to try to look up this information, because my wife was staying off her phone, because the hospital was going to call us when the life flight helicopter arrived. We were waiting for a phone call, and it never occurred to us that we could do the same thing in reverse, which might seem completely ridiculous, but it's actually consistent with findings in cognitive research. It's been shown that every single one of us has a limited amount of cognitive resources, and it's a single pool. And if you drain cognitive resources in doing one thing, you have less cognitive resources to do something else. So as an example, there's been research done where there are two groups of people in the research. One set is given a very easy memorization task, something like memorize 2 numbers. And the other group is given a very hard memorization task, something like memorize 9 numbers in a row. And then when they're done with that task, they're taken to a break room where they have a choice of snack, either like healthy fruit plate or chocolate cake at 10 o'clock in the morning. The ones who have done the difficult memorization task are twice as likely to pick the cake because they don't have the cognitive resources left to exercise willpower. So Karen McGrain has said that you don't get to decide what your users want to do on mobile, which is absolutely true. But my point is we didn't even make a choice. We did not decide what to do on mobile. We simply acted on bare instinct. We became mobile-first users, sort of by force of the context. And the fact that we didn't have the brain power left over to think about ways to get out of this, ways to figure out the situation. Because all of our cognitive resources were being consumed by the circumstance. So to come back to the CHOP website, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia abbreviates to CHOP, and they call it that, which I find really weird, but okay. We come back here, this was not doing anything to help us. I bet this site works for a lot of people, or worked for a lot of people, most of them in marketing and upper management at CHOP. And it probably even works for a decent percentage of their regular users, because a decent percentage of the regular users will resemble the ideal user. This is who we designed for. This is who we're trying to not make think. This cheerful, with it, savvy, focused user, all comfortable and secure in her spotlessly gleaming home of the future. Whatever site she's on is making her really happy. She is so happy to be there. Someone who knows what she wants, has a time and mental capacity to figure out what she's being presented with and, fulfill her goal, whatever that goal is. We try not to make these people think, but they can think, and we rely on that. Of course, if we're honest with ourselves, most of our users probably aren't like this. They're probably more like this. Still savvy and with it, but maybe not so cheerful or focused. Because clearly the kids are having a bad day, they've got bills to pay, they've got stuff to look up, dinner has to get started, there's a million things going on, and coming to your site is just one of them. So they're why we may be at a search box. Give them fallbacks in case they don't spot that clever bit of content that directly relates to what it is they're trying to do. So we do that, we handle this kind of persona, I think, fairly well. And that's good, but it is not enough. You need to add another persona to your list, which is the user in crisis. Someone who is, unable to think, someone who's been pushed beyond that capacity and can barely focus on your awesome design and soothing copy. Bobby, who just found out that his automated mortgage payment has failed for the last few months, and now he's not sure if he's going to be foreclosed on. Or Sarah, who's traveling abroad and has a flight tomorrow and just had her purse stolen along with her passport and needs to figure out how to get travel documents as soon as possible so she can get back home. Or Jennifer, who just got email from a stalker who's made a credible threat against her safety, and now she needs to lock down every bit of her online presence as fast as possible. These are personas that are every bit as developed as others that you might have. They have a background, they have stated goals, they have you might have to search a little harder for stock photos that relate, but it's worth it. And obviously, those personas that I gave only work for specific types of sites. And you might think to yourself, well, I don't have one of those sites. But with some creativity, you can and you should come up with crisis-driven personas that relate to what it is you do. Because when you approach your design, your site, with that sort of persona in mind, it looks different. It presents a different aspect. It does require some empathy. That's not bad. It's just difficult. It can be very hard to put ourselves in that place. But it's worth it, because when you look at your work through other eyes that have been clouded by fear or stress, you can find the weak points in the design very quickly. Now, I am not saying that you should only design for such personas, But so much of the time we talk about people who are in the midst of crisis as edge cases. Edge case is another way of saying, I don't care about that. Instead, these are stress cases, and my contention is that stress cases should come closer to the center. They should be considered as part of this process. So, I am not saying that the CHOP homepage should have simply been nothing but a big link that said, my child is ill, help, although, admittedly, at the moment, that would have been really useful for us. But imagine that it had this up in the center. Unexpected visit, here's what you need to know. That right there in my idealized world would have taken us to exactly the information we needed. And adding that to the For Patients and Visitors drop-down and weaving it in throughout the site, maybe putting it in the sidebar just in case someone happens to glance over there, would have made that information available and still let the CEO feel totally awesome about their US News and World Report banner on the homepage. And this is something that using a crisis persona would have uncovered. And you might wonder, you might think to yourself, what is wrong with CHOP that they did not think about a crisis persona? They are a hospital. I have been on many, many hospital websites in the last 2 years. None of them do this. It's not just CHOP. And none of us are doing it either, or very few of us. The exceptions would be people who are designing things for people who are likely to be in a crisis situation. The example I always think of is the automated external defibrillator devices that are hanging on walls, at least all around America. I'm not sure about here. They're incredibly simple. They're incredibly easy to use because they were designed from the outset to be used by people who have no medical training who maybe need to save somebody's life in a shopping mall. But if that's not the brief, we don't think about these things. And since John mentioned Ted Nelson this morning, I couldn't resist putting a quote in from Ted. So, it's one thing to use personas, but I have another recommendation, which is to also create contexts into which you can set your personas, including your crisis persona. So I'm going to come up with a hypothetical example of a shopping website. Granted, a shopping website has more than 3 personas and 3 contexts, but I only have so much room on a slide, so work with me. So there might be these 3 contexts of someone who's doing online shopping. People who are doing online shopping, they could do it in the middle of the week during their lunch break, at the office. Also after the kids' bedtime, but in that short window before the kids, after the kids go to sleep, but before they go to sleep. For some people, that window is very narrow. And then also on a mobile device in a waiting room, maybe waiting for a tire to get fixed or waiting for an annual checkup. Setting personas into context actually multiplies, in some sense, the number of personas you're working with because context affects how people do things. And that seems obvious to say, but you might actually discover that some personas don't actually even appear in some contexts. And I have a physical world example of this. So back at CHOP, the main elevators have this really cute touch to them, where after you've gotten in and you've pressed the button for your floor, this cheerful kid's voice announces, doors closing, going up, and then the doors close. And you go up to your floor, and then another different cheerful kid's voice says something like, floor 5, nephrology. I guess assuming the people know what nephrology means. Study of the kidney, by the way. So that's great. Kat and I got to the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia literally at the stroke of midnight. And pro tip, in case you ever also find yourself going to the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia at midnight, the front doors are locked. Incidentally, the website did not warn us about that. Also, the emergency room, closed. Yeah, so the hospital is basically deserted at that hour. Most of the lights have been turned off. And walking into a dimly lit hospital at midnight is a little bit creepy under any circumstance. So we got there, we found the security guards behind their incredibly thick bulletproof glass, because America, and they told us, gave us our badges and told us where to go. So we walk across the main atrium of the hospital, which is this 9-story tall, cavernous space with our footsteps echoing back at every step. There are literally no other humans besides the security guards. We don't even see staff. it's dark. We go to, going to the elevators not knowing what's going to happen next, really. I mean, we don't even know that we're going to see our daughter. And we get in the elevators and push the button for 7. Doors closing, going up. And I thought, oh my God, we're in The Shining. And literally, that's what went through my head. It was totally jarring. And it added to that overwhelming sense of disorientation and shock that we were experiencing at that moment. I mean, I think of it now as almost the quintessential definition of user hostile. But if someone had done this, if they had said, hey, let's take some personas, including some crisis personas, and put them in contexts like the middle of the morning and lunchtime and then also midnight, they might have realized, you know what? The platonic ideal of the user and even the harried outpatient user, they are not in the hospital at midnight. There are no outpatient appointments at midnight. The only people, the only users in this case who are going to be in a hospital at midnight are people in crisis. The only other humans that will be there are staff. And I can guarantee you that the staff would be really grateful if those kids would just shut it for a while. So this is a situation, again, where personas plus context would have helped with that situation. And they might have said to themselves, hey, maybe we could not have the kids' voices during the hospital quiet hours. Let's say we'll just go with the standard soft door chimes. So put those two things together, and hopefully you find out things about your design that weren't obvious at first, where you find out, oh, this thing that I've done totally works here, but it's actually the totally wrong thing to do over here. Okay, so that's one example of how designing for crisis actually can help in just about any field. I have another one, which is the airline industry. And no, I'm not going to talk about airline accidents here. I'm actually thinking about things more like delayed flights when you have a connection. So maybe you've built in 2 hours for your connection. That's what I did coming over here, but hey, maybe your first flight is delayed by an hour and a half. And so you land, and you've only got maybe 15 minutes to try to make your next connection. Even if you're one of the first people off of the plane, if you're lucky enough for that, you go sprinting across some sprawling dystopian maze of an airport, trying to find this gate and make it onto your flight just in time. How great would it be if airline smartphone apps, or even websites, gave you a map from the gate you're arriving at to the gate that you're departing from? Because if you're on the smartphone app, most likely you're already signed in. It knows what flight you're on. It knows that that flight is late, and it knows where that's coming in and where the next one is. So boom, turn-by-turn directions right there. So that it's not going to get you there any faster necessarily, although it might help you not go the wrong way in this airport you're not familiar with. But it could let you pre-plan and therefore reduce some of that stress. Another way that could help is the smartphone app could generate a little card that you could show to the people around you that says, I have a tight connection, please let me out first. Sometimes airline attendants do that. They say, some people have tight connections, could you please let them off first? But how do you know who that is? Okay, so that's one area where the airline industry could maybe do things a little better. Another place where they could use help with this is in booking a ticket. I mean, in many cases, booking a ticket is this, again, we're back to this platonic ideal of a user who's, looking up flight times for his 2-week trip to Jamaica in 9 months or whatever it is he's doing, I don't know. But even in that situation, most of our ideal users probably end up more like this by the time they're done. Because holy St. Francis, how bad are airline booking sites? This massive wall of stuff, yeah? And I don't even like dealing with this in general. Now imagine dealing with this in a crisis, right? And a crisis is not necessarily always dire and bad. It could be that your sister, who has moved to another country, just gave birth early to her first child. Baby's fine, mother's fine, but you'd still like to be there as quickly as possible to meet your brand new baby niece. Right now, in that situation, you do not care about what kind of plane you will be on or what kind of meal service you will get, if we can even call it that, right? You just need to know 2 things. How fast can I get there? And what will it cost me? Because we live in that world. And in these situations, when you don't have many cognitive resources, you're more likely to overlook important details, like accidentally reverse sorting by arrival time, so you're actually booking a flight that will get you there in 2 days after a 27-hour layover in John F. Kennedy. And most unified booking sites, not much better. In fact, I would argue in some ways worse. But I have an exception, which at least in the US, I don't know if you have one similar here, but Hipmunk. Hipmunk is great. It shows you how long your trip is very clearly so that you don't do something like I did once, which is try to book a trip between February 1st and February 4th, and misclick and book a trip between February 1st and March 4th. Yeah, that was embarrassing when I showed up at the airport. You're not on this flight, but okay. What will it cost me? Okay, and then once you've input that, you have these amazingly clear search results. Right? You want to get there right now? Search by landing time. Boom. This is how soon you can get there. Do you want the cheapest option? Sort by price. Turns out it's cheaper to get from Cleveland to Washington, D.C. by Amtrak than anything else. It just takes an incredibly long time. And I can see that. You can see that. You can see those bars at the top. So we can look at this price, and I might discover that an extra $20 gets me on a direct flight instead of a connecting flight. And then there's the agony sort, which I think is one of the greatest labeling choices of all time. It sorts flights from least agonizing to most agonizing. They don't tell you the exact process they come to that by. It's some combination of connections and price and so on. But anyway, the point being, this is a design that works for anybody, including people in crisis. It's really easy to understand. And if you're acting in leisure instead of in crisis, this thing is a total joy to use. And that's one of the points I'm making here. If you consider stress cases, crisis cases, and make it so that they can use your service or understand your site, then people who are not in that situation are going to have no trouble at all. It actually becomes a joy to use. I love this site, even if, and this is often the case, I don't have much flexibility in terms of date or air carrier. I still come here to find out what my best options are, and I actually feel kind of good about it. I feel like I understand what's going on. Even though all this does is it tells me, lets me figure out what my flights are, and then when I say, these are the flights that I want, it literally sends me to the airline website to complete my purchase. It's not even a middleman. They're just providing information. So, I'm hoping one of these days I actually get to meet some of the people from Hipmunk so that I can do a little we're not worthy thing to them. Anyway, so speaking of travel, I want to go back to the road. In 2012, actually again on vacation in New Jersey, I was driving the minivan through an intersection when a car on the cross street decided to jump off the stop sign and Tbone our minivan, which, to be fair, is a traditional form of greeting in New Jersey. So the car was drivable. Our car was drivable. Theirs was not. Ours was drivable, making some worrying noises, admittedly, but suppose it hadn't been. Suppose that it had been hit in such a way that it couldn't go anywhere. In America, we have AAA, the American Automobile Association. I guess here you have just the Automobile Association, so well done you. And one of the things, at least for AAA, when people think of AAA, they think of roadside assistance. Can you tell me where on here there's roadside assistance? It's a trick question. It's actually down here. And then actually, once you get there, it's legendary roadside assistance. One of the many reasons to join AAA. Wait, but what if I want roadside assistance? I mean, you would think that it's showing me this because it wants me to be a member. I am signed in as a member when I took the screenshot. It turns out that the Automobile Association here, I looked at the website, not a lot better, sorry. At least on the mobile, you have to scroll a very long time before you get to the I need roadside assistance thing, okay? As opposed to the AAA mobile app, where boom, roadside assistance is number 2. And I actually like that better than it being number 1 because that means it's closer to the center instead of having to go all the way up to the top. It's a little thing, but roadside assistance, bam, so great. And their old mobile site was very similar. Road service, first thing, right? Taking the assumption that, if somebody's coming to the AAA mobile site, they might need some help. They might be actually on a roadside in the middle of Pennsylvania. And for those of you who are not familiar with American geography, Pennsylvania is nothing but forest, basically, and a couple of interstates. And then there's 2 cities at either end. That's pretty much Pennsylvania. And by the way, it's about 600 kilometers long. So yeah, this is actually, it's interesting, AAA is both done wrong and done right. The desktop site completely buries the whole I need roadside assistance. And okay, you might think to yourself, who's going to be on the desktop site if they need roadside assistance? The last 2 times I called AAA for roadside assistance, it was because I had a car in my driveway that wouldn't start. And so I went inside to go onto the AAA website while I was on the phone, doing things like calling our kids' daycare to say, I will not be there to pick them up as I thought I would, car will not start, right? So it's not enough to say, nobody will ever use this in this context. Yeah, maybe they will, and you just haven't thought of why. It's really not up to us to judge what our users are going to be doing. Okay, so I don't want this to be all about people are doing things wrong, grah, the word is terrible. Okay, I actually want to go back to medical imaging for a crisis design success story that is nothing short of incredible. So medical imaging is really amazing. I mean, we can take pictures of the insides of people without having to cut them open. That's Star Trek level stuff right there. The thing about it is that, unfortunately, the equipment that makes that possible tends to look like a cross between the Jetsons and THX-1138 with just a few undertones of H.R. Giger thrown in for flavor. They're in these usually spare and harsh and antiseptically white rooms, which I guess the design theory there is that you're communicating to the patient that white room is clean and therefore safe medically. Unfortunately, it also tends to communicate the message of this is an incredibly alien environment. I'm kind of freaked out just looking at that picture. Now, I want you to imagine what it's like if you're a small child that needs medical imaging. Okay? You're already in a generally unfamiliar environment. Your parents are probably giving off all kinds of stress signals because they are scared, and no matter how hard they try to hide it, you can tell. In fact, the harder they try to hide it, the more scared you're probably getting, because if your parents are hiding something, then it's probably really bad. And you're being shown this enormous machine, and remember, half the size means everything looks twice as big to them as it does to us. This enormous machine that looks like it's been designed to vaporize you, and some stranger's like, yeah, you're just gonna lie in here. Right? It's a wonder that any kids ever get imaged at all. So I want you to meet the GE Adventure Series. These are complete user experiences that are built around medical imaging equipment with a whole bunch of different themes. Now, they have a mission statement where they manage to get all the right buzzwords. Somehow they put leveraging in there. But honestly, this headline is their actual mission statement. It's perfect. From terrifying to terrific. The core goal here is not to just, make things look pretty. It is to reduce sedation in children. Because the thing about medical imaging is that, as incredible as it is, it's not Star Trek quite yet. You can't just wave a thing at a kid or any patient and then just have a 3D map of the inside of them. Medical imaging requires the patient to lie perfectly still for the length of the scan. And with MRIs, that can be a very long time. I don't know about you, but I can't even get my kids to lie still for that long when they're calm, let alone when they're freaking out. So typically, if a child needs to be imaged, they are given general sedative, general anesthetic, in order to knock them out and completely immobilize them for the scan. There are a lot of problems with sedation, the rarest of which, but the most serious, is that anesthetic can sometimes produce a side effect that leads to death. But the bigger problems are that it just takes a long time. There's an hour of setup time, there's the actual scan, and then probably 2 hours of recovery. Afterward, that's taking up a bed for 3 hours, at least, and hospitals only have so many beds. I mean, sedation is expensive, it makes the whole process slower, and it has medical risks, so reducing the incidence of sedation is only a good thing. Now, the story you hear about the Adventure Series is that a lone visionary at General Electric, Doug Dietz, shown here, realized that this was a problem and decided to change it. That's part of the story, but it's not the whole story. In fact, he did realize this was a problem, and he wasn't in a position to change it. But right around the same time, the staff at the Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh coincidentally also in Pennsylvania, had realized that this was a problem and set about trying to fix it. What they did was they bought some decorations, I think at a local party store, and put them up in the CT scan preparation room, and basically and created a treasure chest full of a random assortment of toys, and promised the kids that if they lay still for their scan, they could have their pick from the treasure chest at the end of the procedure. The payoff was incredible, nothing short of astonishing. In 2005, at the Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh, they sedated 354 children for CT scans. And remember, general anesthetic, completely unconscious. 2 years later, in 2007, they had to sedate 4 children. Using minimal design to soothe fears and calm anxieties, they cut their pediatric CT sedation rate 99% in 2 years. Furthermore, thanks to the almost complete elimination of that time that was necessary, that 3 hours that I mentioned, over those 2 years, the wait time for an elective CT scan went from 17 days to 0. And over that 2 years, the number of CT scans they did went up 15%. So their scans went up 15%, the sedations dropped 99%, and the wait time fell to 0. Instead of waiting 2.5 weeks to find out what was wrong with a child, they could find out that day or maybe the next. I want you to imagine how much anxiety and dread those children and their families were spared in those 2 years. And for that matter, how many children who didn't have 2.5 weeks had their lives saved. I have spent half of my life and all of my career in and around design, and this is far and away the greatest act of design that I have ever seen. And they did it collaboratively between the Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh and GE Medical Imaging Division. They had weekly conference calls, bringing in experts from a whole host of fields, music therapists, aromatherapists, child life specialists, industrial designers, visual designers. They did user research on children to find out if their ideas had any traction. Imagine doing user research on a cranky 4-year-old, right? And they looked at every aspect of the problem. Not only did they make the experience better for families and children, but also for the people who had to operate the equipment, right? As many as components as possible needed to be easy to repair. They needed to be easily cleanable. The components had to be durable so they could stand up to all that cleaning, and also children. They had to be hypoallergenic. They had to be made from materials that would not interfere with the imaging systems. The manufacturer had to be environmentally friendly, and it all had to be affordable, and they did it. They got all of that for a cost of less than $50,000 per room, which sounds like a lot, but when you find out what the actual imaging equipment costs, that's closer to a rounding error. So this is the Pirate Island theme. Awesome. There's also a space adventure, also awesome. The conceit here being that the kids are going on a trip through a wormhole, and the spaceship engines will make a lot of whirring and whooshing and clanking sounds. Those are actually the sounds of the CT or the MRI, but they don't tell the kids that. They leverage the imagination, right? So in 2009, the Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh opened a brand new facility where they used the Adventure Series across all of their types of medical imaging, CT, MRI, PET, and so on. Now, MRIs typically take much longer than CT scans. Some MRIs can take more than an hour. So there's still going to be some sedation of children, possibly also adults. I don't know the last time I tried to lay perfectly still for an hour, but I doubt it went well. But they opened this brand new facility, and in the first 2 years that the facility was open, across all types of imaging, the number of sedations that they did dropped 25.2%, but the number of scans that they did went up 66%. If you normalize those numbers, that is more than a 50% drop in pediatric sedation rate. All that happened because professionals took a look at what they were doing through the eyes of people in crisis, through eyes of clouded by fear and stress. I mean, they made the experience of getting a CT, of getting medical imaging so enjoyable. They have children who throw temper tantrums when the scan is done and they have to leave the room. When is the last time a user threw a tantrum for having to walk away from your design? So, we often say that design is a thankless task because when you do good work, it becomes invisible. But today I have set you with the most thankless task of all. I've asked you to do things that will never be noticed, things that will be ignored in precisely the way that design often aspires to be, because if your design helps someone who's in the middle of a crisis situation, whether it's personal or medical or whatever it is, they're not going to notice what you did. They're not going to see the roadblocks that aren't there. But you will have helped them in the most profound way simply by not adding to their burdens. So if you do that well, they will never thank you. So instead, let me thank you now in their place. And when you do launch a solution that will help them, get in touch with me directly so that I can thank you personally for using your experience, your skills, and your compassion in service to those who most need it. Thank you.